I stayed at the end of the long conference table, shoulders square, my hands resting flat beside a yellow legal pad that wasn't mine. The room smelled faintly of espresso and printer toner. No one offered me a chair. Across from me, Mari's Lorne leaned back like she owned the air. She did, in a way. Her father's name was on the building, on the stationery, on the framed awards lining the wall behind her. Two attorneys sat to her right, jackets still on, briefcases open. A man from the bank watched his watch like he was paid by the minute. The CFO stood near the window, phone face down in his palm. Mari's tapped her manicured nail once against a folder, a clean, impatient sound. "Before we begin," she said, loud enough that it carried to the hallway, "I need one thing made clear." Nobody interrupted her, not even her mother, who kept twisting her wedding band as if friction could change facts. Mari's gaze slid over the table and landed on me with casual disgust. "Your staff," she said. "You don't sit in on these meetings. You don't speak unless spoken to. You don't take notes. You don't even listen." The bank representative shifted in his chair. One of the attorneys looked down at a printed agenda as if the paper could give him somewhere else to be. Mari's smiled at that small discomfort and pushed through it. "You're invisible," she added. "That's why you were hired. That's your value." I didn't move. I let the words sit where she dropped them. The CFO cleared his throat like he might object, then didn't. He stared at the glass carafe of water in the center of the table, the kind with a heavy base that made even pouring feel formal. A single bead of condensation ran down its side. Mari's lifted her chin toward the doorway. "Mina," she called. She never used my name correctly, and today she wasn't even trying. "Why are you still here?" One of the attorneys finally spoke, careful. "Miss Lorne, we asked that." Mari's cut him off without looking at him. "No, I'm asking, because I'm done pretending this is normal." Her father's chair at the head of the table was empty. Not symbolically, literally empty. The leather still held the impression of him, but he wasn't coming in to rescue the room from her. Mari's pointed at the corner where I stood. "Out," she said. "Now, and if you need to be useful, go make coffee for people who matter." For a moment, the only sound was the HVAC and the faint buzz of someone's phone vibrating against wood. I looked at the agenda in front of the attorney, black text, neat bullet points, today's date in the header, and then I looked back at Mari's. I said nothing. And the silence, held on purpose, made everyone else start to hear what she'd just done. My name is Alina Carver. I was 41 at the time, and I had been living on the Lorne property for almost 7 years. I worked out of the East Wing, where deliveries came in and schedules were kept, and where problems were handled before they reached the family. I had my own apartment on the grounds, a keyed office, and standing authority to approve expenses under 6 figures without prior sign-off. Vendors answered my calls. Banks returned them. When something broke, it was fixed. When something went wrong, it rarely reached the dining room. I kept the household running through 3 renovations, 2 medical emergencies, and 1 very public acquisition that required discretion from everyone involved. I reported directly to Mr. Lorne until his health failed, and then, by default, to whoever spoke loudest in his absence. That morning, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The fact that Mari's didn't understand that had never altered my position. What made that morning notable wasn't the insult itself. Words like that tend to land softly when they follow a pattern. What mattered was where it happened, and who was in the room when it was said. I had been responsible for the continuity of the Lorne household and its adjacent operations for years. That included safeguarding schedules, mediating access, and ensuring that sensitive matters never became public complications. When Mr. Lorne's health declined, I absorbed responsibilities that were never formally reassigned, because someone still had to carry them. I handled the coordination between legal counsel and family without appearing in either camp. I made sure information arrived when it was meant to and not before. That balance mattered. It always had. Mari's decision to humiliate me in a room filled with outside professionals wasn't impulsive. It followed the same structure she'd used before: assert dominance publicly, force silence privately, and assume no one would correct her. That assumption, more than the insult, was the error. The position was never decorative. It was operational. My responsibilities were documented, audited, and renewed annually through a third-party firm that specialized in estate management for families with public exposure. I oversaw household staff, security coordination, vendor contracts, and compliance protocols tied to insurance, zoning, and financial disclosure. There were checklists. There were thresholds. There were signatures that mattered. Most days began before 6. Deliveries were logged, not waved through. Maintenance reports were read, not skimmed. I approved travel manifests, reconciled expense accounts, and flagged inconsistencies before they became questions someone else would have to answer. When outside consultants came through, they met me first, whether they realized it or not. I learned early that silence accelerated efficiency. If I spoke only when necessary, people listened when it mattered. If I waited, processes revealed their weak points without prompting. That habit carried over into everything. Maurice rarely noticed any of this. She treated outcomes as inevitable and effort as invisible. If an event ran smoothly, it was assumed. If something failed, someone unnamed absorbed the fault. That was the arrangement she'd grown up with, and she saw no reason to revise it. There were moments, small, instructive ones, when others noticed. A contractor pausing before answering me, a banker lowering his voice when I entered the room, an attorney confirming a detail with me instead of asking her. Those moments never lingered. I didn't encourage them. I kept my authority narrow and precise. I didn't argue in public. I didn't correct Maurice when she spoke inaccurately about timelines or access. I let the record stand as it was written, not as she described it. In rooms like the one that morning, my presence was procedural. I was there because the agenda required continuity, and continuity required someone who knew where the gaps were. If Maurice had bothered to ask, she would have been told that my role was embedded, not optional. She didn't ask. She never had. And so she mistook restraint for absence and position for permission. Maurice's behavior that morning wasn't new. It was simply louder. Over time, she developed a habit of asserting herself in rooms where she believed no one would challenge her. She spoke over people who worked for her. She corrected professionals on subjects she hadn't read about. When frustration surfaced, it was redirected downward, never laterally. I was a convenient surface. She commented on my presence as if it were an inconvenience rather than a function. She referred to me as the help, even after being corrected more than once. When guests asked who coordinated events or resolved issues, she answered for me, inaccurately, and moved on. I never corrected her publicly. That wasn't restraint born of fear. It was position. Correcting her would have shifted attention without improving outcomes. The systems I maintained didn't require her approval to function, only her neglect. There were moments when the pattern became obvious to others. A visiting advisor once asked me a question directly, and Maurice interrupted to answer. When the advisor followed up with me anyway, she laughed it off and changed the subject. The laugh was sharp, defensive. I noted those moments without reacting to them. Patterns don't need confrontation to be confirmed. They repeat themselves until they're undeniable. The important detail was consistency. Maurice didn't humiliate selectively. She did it reflexively, especially when control felt threatened. That made her predictable. Predictability in any system reduces risk, so I kept my responses limited to what was required. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't push back. I documented interactions when they intersected with operations and ignored them when they didn't. That distinction mattered later. By the time that meeting occurred, Maurice had already established the terms she believed governed our interaction. She spoke. I absorbed. Others watched and stayed neutral. It looked like imbalance. It wasn't. The investment existed long before Maurice decided I was invisible. 8 years earlier, the Lorne Group needed capital quickly and quietly. A planned expansion had stalled after a regulatory delay, and conventional financing came with conditions Mr. Lorne wasn't willing to accept. Public disclosure would have affected negotiations elsewhere. Speed mattered. So did discretion. I provided both. The funds moved through a private holding entity structured for anonymity, one I had established years earlier for conservative, long-term placements. The agreement was formal, reviewed by external counsel, and filed correctly. It wasn't a favor. It was an exchange. Capital in return for conditional equity, convertible upon specific financial triggers that were clearly defined. Those triggers weren't dramatic. They were practical. Liquidity shortfalls, covenant breaches, or a failure to meet scheduled obligations beyond a fixed grace period. No emotion, no interpretation, just numbers and dates. At the time, Mr. Lorne understood exactly what he was signing. We discussed it twice, once with attorneys present and once alone, seated across from each other in his study. He asked why I insisted on remaining unnamed. I told him the truth, that visibility complicates governance. He nodded and accepted that without offense. The arrangement wasn't designed as leverage. It was designed as protection. For the company, for the employees, for the capital itself. Over the years, the investment sat quietly. Reports were delivered on schedule. Performance was tracked. I never attended shareholder meetings. I never voted. I never interfered. Silence in that context preserved stability. When Mr. Lorne's health declined, the reporting continued as written. When Maries stepped into decision-making without fully understanding the structure beneath her, the reporting still continued. Systems don't require awareness to function. They require compliance. By the time that morning's meeting took place, several conditions had already been met. Grace periods had expired. Notices had been issued through appropriate channels. None of this was new. None of it was reactive. It was simply waiting to be acknowledged. Once the initial notices were issued, the process slowed, as it always does when multiple institutions are involved. That wasn't a flaw. It was a safeguard. The bank requested verification of prior filings. Counsel asked for certified copies of agreements that were already archived. Compliance teams reviewed timelines, then reviewed them again. Each step introduced a pause, and each pause confirmed that the structure would hold under scrutiny. I responded only when required. Documents were transmitted through secure channels. Calls were returned within the same business day, never immediately. There is a difference between availability and urgency, and the distinction matters when decisions carry weight. At one point, an external advisor suggested an informal conversation might smooth things over. I declined without explanation. Informality benefits whoever is already off balance. This wasn't a situation that needed smoothing. It needed accuracy. Weeks passed. Then another reporting cycle closed. Another obligation went unmet. The language in the agreements was unambiguous. Dates passed. Thresholds were crossed. Each confirmation narrowed the remaining options without requiring any input from me. By the time the meeting on the estate calendar was scheduled, the one Maries assumed was about short-term liquidity. Every relevant authority had already reached the same conclusion independently. The mechanism was active. The conversion process had begun. No single person caused that outcome. It was the result of alignment between facts, contracts, and time. Responsibility and entitlement are not interchangeable. The second meeting took place 3 days later, in the smaller boardroom on the north side of the property. The windows faced the trees instead of the drive, and the table was narrower, built for decisions rather than display. I arrived early and took the chair against the wall, not the table. A leather folder rested on my lap, closed. I didn't open it. The weight of it was enough. Maries entered last, speaking before she crossed the threshold. Her tone was sharp, rehearsed. She stopped when she saw who was already seated. 2 attorneys she hadn't hired. A representative from the bank's restructuring division. An external trustee she'd never met. The room went quiet in a way that felt intentional. One of the attorneys began by reading the agenda. His voice was even. Each item was procedural. No accusations, no commentary. When he reached the section marked Capital Conversion Review, Maries interrupted, already irritated. "This is unnecessary," she said. "We're handling this internally." The attorney paused. He didn't respond immediately. He adjusted the alignment of the papers in front of him, squared the stack, and then looked up. "This review is not optional," he said. I watched Maries process that. Her eyes moved from face to face, searching for someone who would back her. No one did. The bank representative spoke next, outlining missed covenants and elapsed grace periods. Dates were stated aloud. Amounts were confirmed. Each sentence landed and stayed where it was placed. I remained still. I didn't clarify. I didn't correct. When the trustee asked if all parties were present, the attorney nodded and answered for the room. By the time the folder in my lap was finally opened, by someone else, the direction of the meeting had already shifted. The outcome was no longer theoretical. It was being documented. Maris leaned forward, palms flat on the table, as if proximity could reassert control. "This is being exaggerated," she said. Her voice was louder now, edged with irritation she didn't bother to mask. "We've missed targets before. This doesn't trigger anything." No one answered her immediately. The trustee glanced at the bank representative. The bank representative glanced at the attorney. The delay was brief, but it mattered. Maris noticed it. Her jaw tightened. "The agreements are specific," the attorney said at last. "This isn't a matter of interpretation." Maris laughed once sharply. "You're telling me a temporary shortfall hands over control? That's absurd." The bank representative didn't raise his voice. "It's not temporary," he said, "and it's not sudden." She turned toward me then, as if remembering I was in the room again. "You," she said, "you know this business better than anyone here. Tell them this is overblown." I let the silence stretch. I looked down at the edge of the table, where the wood grain changed direction near the seam. Then I looked back up. "I'm not here to advise," I said. My voice stayed level. "I'm here to observe." Her eyes widened slightly. It was the first visible crack. "That's not an answer," she snapped. "It's the correct one," I replied and stopped there. The trustee slid a document forward. "This outlines the conversion process," he said. "It began prior to this meeting." Maris skimmed the first page too quickly, then the second. Her breathing changed, faster, shallower. "This can't be right," she said. "My father would have told me." One of the attorneys responded without looking at her. "Your father was informed." The room went quiet again, not awkward, final. Maris pushed her chair back abruptly. It scraped against the floor, the sound sharp and out of place. "So what, this just happens?" she demanded. "Without my consent," the trustee nodded once. "Consent was given when the agreements were executed." She looked around the room, searching for leverage that wasn't there anymore. Her voice dropped. "We can fix this," she said. "We can renegotiate." No one moved. No one reached for a pen. The process continued, uninterrupted. The trustee waited until Maris sat back down. He didn't rush her. He didn't soften his tone. "What happens next is not a negotiation," he said. "It's a sequence." He turned a page. The paper made a dry, precise sound. "Control transfers in stages," he continued. "Oversight first, voting authority next. Operational authority follows." Maris shook her head, slower now. "You're talking about stripping my family of our company." "No," the attorney said. "We're talking about enforcing terms that were already agreed to." She looked at me again. This time there was calculation in her expression, not anger. "You knew," she said. "You had to know." I met her eyes and let the silence answer first. When I spoke, it was brief. "I was aware of the structure," I said. "Yes." That was all. Her voice dropped. "Then stop it." The trustee intervened before I could respond. "Miss Lorne, there is nothing to stop. The conversion notice was validated last quarter. The filings are complete." He slid another document across the table. "This confirms the effective date." Maris reached for it with both hands. Her fingers trembled despite her effort to control them. She scanned the page, slower this time, lips moving as she read. Dates, signatures, seals. "This can't be undone," she asked. The bank representative answered. "Not through discussion." She looked around the room one last time, searching for sympathy. None appeared. Professionals don't improvise when the record is clear. "What about appeals?" she asked. "Those are outlined," the attorney said. "They don't affect the transfer." Her shoulders dropped slightly. The fight drained out of her posture, replaced by something closer to disbelief. The trustee closed his folder. "You'll receive formal notice by end of day," he said. "From that point forward, correspondence will be directed through appointed channels." Maris opened her mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left to add that would change anything. I stayed where I was, hands still, voice quiet. The system moved forward without me needing to touch it. Power only looks personal when structure is ignored. I wasn't present for what followed. That was by design. 2 weeks after the meeting, formal notices were issued to the family office and copied to external counsel. The language was restrained and exact. Oversight committees were named. Interim controls were put in place. Access required approval where it hadn't before. By the end of the first month, Mari's legal team filed an objection. It was rejected on procedural grounds. A revised filing followed, narrower, more careful. That one failed quietly, without commentary. Quarterly reporting closed with revised signatures. Long-standing vendor relationships were reviewed and, in several cases, paused. Credit terms were adjusted. Invitations stopped arriving. By mid-year, the company's public profile changed. Press releases became shorter. Appearances were limited. The family name remained on paper, but less often in conversation. Friends recalibrate faster than contracts. Dinners were postponed. Calls went unanswered. Familiar seats at familiar tables stayed empty. That contraction didn't make headlines. It didn't need to. I learned about these developments the same way anyone else would, through brief updates forwarded without comment, through notices written for records, not reactions. Each one confirmed what the documents already promised. I made no inquiries. I had nothing to add. The structure did what it was designed to do, and it did it without spectacle. By the end of the year, my role on the property concluded formally. The transition was handled through the same firm that had overseen my appointment. Keys were logged. Access was transferred. The handover checklist was signed and archived. I moved back into my own schedule without interruption. Mornings stayed quiet. Work continued elsewhere, in rooms where my presence was expected and understood. No one asked me about the Lornes. I didn't volunteer anything. Once, months later, I passed Mari's at a charity function I attended on behalf of another organization. We didn't speak. She looked past me, then looked again, uncertain. I gave a small nod, polite, neutral, and continued on. That was the extent of it. Systems don't remember insults. They remember agreements. When those agreements are enforced correctly, emotion becomes irrelevant. What happened wasn't personal. It was orderly. It restored balance where assumption had replaced responsibility. Respect isn't demanded. It's enforced by structure. The matter was finished, and it stayed that way.